In this video, I want to cover some terminology you're likely to see when you start discussing sharing or deploying your FileMaker solution to your team. Most people have seen some of this terminology, but odds are you've missed a couple things along the way, so this is a chance for us to get you caught up. So first off, as a reminder, the most common term we're going to hear when talking about a FileMaker solution is that it might be a solution, or it might be a FileMaker custom application, or it might be a FileMaker template, or you might hear the words FileMaker Database. Now, all these things essentially mean the same thing, and these terms have been used interchangeably over the last 30 plus years. What's important to understand is that you might have a solution with one or more FileMaker files, and those are FMP12 files. Those files together would be collectively known as your solution or your custom app, template, database, etc. Now, the term database is interesting. A database is just an organization of numbers or information. And from a very rudimentary understanding, you could consider an Excel spreadsheet the very basic essence of a database. However, when you build a FileMaker application, it's typically much more than just the database itself. It also includes the front-end interface. So you might hear the term schema or structure when you build a FileMaker file. And as you build a layout, you will create relationships, you might write scripts. You're essentially creating the structure of the file or the schema of the file, which is decidedly different than the data within the file. And that data within the file is contained within the database. So really you have the database, and then you have the schema or structure that surrounds that database. So as an analogy, the schema or structure of your solution might be the frame of the building with the walls and the roof, etc. And the people are the data inside. Now, we use another term in a very similar fashion, and that's the idea of deploying your custom database or app or solution, right? So we're talking about sharing it with your team. The terminology deploy and share effectively means the same thing in the world of FileMaker. So if you build a custom application on your local computer, then you want to share it with your team. You're going to need to take that solution and load it up on the server, i.e. you're going to deploy that solution to the server. Now, when you deploy your solution to a server, there are actually a number of choices you can select in terms of how you do that. In fact, just now in the previous sentence, I used the word server to generically indicate a place where we're going to park the database so other people can use it. And most people these days understand the idea of a server and what it does. Web servers share websites. Email systems are email servers, and they share and distribute email. File servers share files as well. If you use Dropbox or Box.net or maybe Google OneDrive, that's a very fancy file server. And of course, Claris has its own FileMaker server as well. In fact, the folks at Claris frequently talk about the word host as a generic term for something that shares the data out on the internet. So Claris will frequently refer to their server as a host. And I've never really been quite clear on this because host or hosting is not really accepted modern terminology. Very few people use host in that context. A host is someone who runs an Airbnb, for example. That's a very popular context that most people understand. If you say the word server, people understand what that is. But if you call your server a host, you're likely to confuse the people around you. Now let's talk about the term FileMaker Server. FileMaker Server, strictly speaking, is the software package that Claris Corporation makes available to install on Mac, Windows, or Linux-based systems. So essentially you have your own piece of hardware, or maybe you have some hardware that's up in a data center. And on that hardware, you have a Mac OS or Windows or Linux operating systems, and you would choose the appropriate version of FileMaker Server to install on that hardware. And of course, people will say, hey, what's going on with the FileMaker Server? So in common usage with the FileMaker community, the FileMaker Server is somewhat of a generic term, and people use it to mean the hardware or the FileMaker Server software. Or sometimes they say, hey, the FileMaker Server has crashed, in which case they mean both the hardware and the software used together in that particular sentence. And in this case, of course, they're indicating that it's not available and it's crashed and needs to be restarted. So the term FileMaker Server is a little bit loose, and it depends on the context of the person when they say it as to what they mean. So just remember that the term FileMaker Server may mean just the software, just the hardware, or both of those combined on a single box. Years ago, Claris took a version of FileMaker Server for Linux and adapted it for use on Amazon's AWS data centers. Now, when I'm talking about Amazon, I'm not talking about the idea of buying groceries on Amazon and having them delivered to your door. Amazon's actually known for two things. One is, of course, their shopping enterprise, which of course now includes movie streaming and things like that. But in order to build the infrastructure to drive that shopping experience, Amazon built data centers all around the world. In fact, they built so many data centers that they actually built too much. So what Amazon does, they sell off the extra capacity of these data centers, the extra unused servers that are in the data centers, and people can use those to host their websites, their solutions, and of course, host FileMaker Server. And so what Claris did was that they rolled together their FileMaker Server Linux product, packaged it up on an Amazon AWS server, and Claris resells that as a product known as Claris FileMaker Cloud. Now, when looking at the price of Claris FileMaker Cloud, people notice it being more expensive than FileMaker Server. And that's because Claris has bundled together both the hardware costs and the software license into one package that they set up for you that you don't have to bother with. So really, if you have a very simple solution and you're not going to have a lot of extraneous connections to like credit card processing and things like that, the FileMaker Cloud solution is pretty slick. However, it does have some substantial limitations when compared with the regular FileMaker Server for Mac, Windows, or Linux. One of the biggest ones is that it won't allow you to run plugins or third-party add-ons on the FileMaker Server. So if you need to have server-side plugins, which about half or two-thirds of my customers need, then those people are out of luck if they want to use FileMaker Cloud. They need to use FileMaker Server and have their own server set up by someone other than Claris. Now, additional things to keep in mind in terms of terminology, and we've mentioned this in the security conversation a little bit. When you set up a FileMaker server, you're going to need to consider the SSL certificate. If you're a technical person, you've already heard this term before. Most websites are encrypted. An SSL certificate allows a website or your FileMaker server to encrypt the data that's being sent to the user. If you set up your own FileMaker server, you're going to have to manually set up and configure your SSL certificate. If you buy FileMaker Cloud, then that's all part of the automated installation process, and Claris handles that for you. In fact, they take the cost of the SSL certificate and they roll it into the complete price of FileMaker Cloud. Now, another term that you may hear bounced around is peer-to-peer sharing. Peer-to-peer sharing is a very old technology. It was introduced in the early 1990s as a way to share FileMaker solutions between users on Mac and Windows. Essentially, you could open up a copy of your FileMaker application in FileMaker Pro and share it with other users on your local network. This is a deprecated feature that Claris has explicitly said is being removed from the product. Why? Well, peer-to-peer sharing doesn't provide for SSL encryption, so your data is exposed on the network to malicious users or other people. Peer-to-peer sharing doesn't provide automatic backups, and it doesn't scale beyond 5 simultaneous users. So just keep in mind that if you hear someone talking about peer-to-peer sharing, generally it's a way of trying to save money and not buy FileMaker Server, but it's pretty limited, and I expect this feature to be removed from the FileMaker platform at some point, if it hasn't been removed already. So in terms of critical terminology, you have terminology that describes the individual FileMaker solution, which might be one or more FMP12 files. That's the term FileMaker Database, FileMaker App or Custom App, FileMaker Solution, FileMaker Template. Then you hear people talk about deploying or sharing the solution, which is the idea of putting it up on a server. Once again, the term FileMaker Server is somewhat loose. That means the hardware or the software or both of them together. You'll hear the term SSL encryption, which is the encryption between the server and the client. And you get that by purchasing an SSL certificate from a third-party vendor. And that price will run between, say, $50 and $100 on an annual or 2-year basis. You'll also hear the term peer-to-peer sharing, which is a legacy feature which has been or will be removed from the FileMaker platform.